One of the reasons why John Maynard Keynes, in his work on unemployment and interest rates, was considered so revolutionary was because it was a total break from the economic theory that preceded it. Although today I'm going to be addressing some of the claims that Steve Keen made on Escaped Sapiens podcast. So he makes a number of arguments, claims about economics, and I just want to get into that.
So they fail on the very first ground of being driven by observation molecules. And a lot of people therefore say it's not a science because of the nature of the object being studied has volition, and therefore you can't apply laws of mathematics to it. There's enough foundations on which you can actually build something, which is you could.
The topic, in case it's not clear from his rambling, is economics a science?
Call a science, but in no way does what economics currently does qualify as a science. And the major reason is that the big shift for science itself was to get away from the belief of science was reading the great books and then, bringing Aristotle up to date in the 1500s, which was the nature of so-called science before the.
So, what he's lampooning, I think, is actually a solid approach, which is building a coherent and consistent edifice of theory. That's basically what he's attacking, this idea.
Copernican revolution. Economics is still dominated by the great book. So if you want to understand what an economist believes, grab hold of Alfred Marshall's Principles of Economics back in the 1890s to the 1920s, and anything that contradicts Marshall, they don't want to know about. So they
I think he's just completely out to lunch here. That just does not describe the modern economics profession. It's the complete opposite. It's like the modern economics profession is entirely divorced from the great body of economic theory that was painstakingly developed over the centuries. The modern economics profession is all about logical positivism, empiricism. Nobody cares what Marshall thought. Like, very few economists are interested in the history of economic thought. It's really an obscure field within the science, and it's just untrue that economics is like a dogmatic subject. Actually, I think the economics profession as a whole would be in a much better place if there was more concern about integrating modern quote unquote economic research with the great body of economic theory that was devised in the 18th and 19th century.
about. So they fail on the very first ground of being driven by observation, empirical induction, abduction, as it's called as well. They deduce stuff from ideas you can find in Marshall, which you can date back to earlier economists like Jean-Baptiste Say and Augustin Cournot. But fundamentally, they are non-scientific in the worst possible sense of the word.
I would imagine
the topic of the proper methodological approach to economics is an important one. I hold the Misesian view that economics is really just a subset of praxeology, the science of human action, and that it is fundamentally a deductive science. That is, economic laws should be discovered not through empirical observations, but through deductions made to the action axiom. So the action axiom, the idea that man acts, and we can say man acts purposefully, but that's redundant. Action is inherently purposeful. So man acts, and this is what Kant described as a synthetic a priori judgment. So, despite being a very simple sentence, just two words, it contains a great wealth of information. The word man contains everything we know about humankind, and then acts contains everything we know about action, which implies a great deal of other stuff. So we know that the statement man acts is undeniably true. You can't even argue against it, since by arguing against it, you're acting, you're proving that it's true. So if you have a undeniably false statement, then you can apply the rules of logic and deduce other true statements. So why is this important? Why is this the proper methodology? Well, if you take the logical positivism approach that Keene here recommends, you're going to be hopelessly waylaid with dead ends. You're going to be staring at sheafs of statistical data and trying to infer something meaningful from that, and you're not going to be able to do it. If you don't have a proper understanding of economic theory to guide you in your investigations, you're just going to get hopelessly lost. And we see this with the modern economics profession, with the so called research on the minimum wage. It's simply not true that economics should ape the physical sciences when it comes to setting up experiments and trying to isolate variables. I mean, you can attempt to do that, there's nothing wrong with it, but that's not how you determine or prove economic laws. Certainly, it is possible or important in, for example, economic history, in exploring the empirical data, the causes and effects, the things that happened, the statistical information, and putting that in the proper context. But you need that guiding light of economic theory to lead the way. So, going back to this idea of, the book, the big book of economics, which Keene seems to think the economics profession as a whole sort of subscribes to, this idea that there is economic theory or dogma or truth in Marshall's teachings or whatever. One of the reasons why John Maynard Keynes, in his work on unemployment and interest rates, was considered so revolutionary was because it was a total break from the economic theory that preceded it. And just like how Einstein's work was a revolutionary break from Newtonian mechanics, so Keynes's views on macroeconomics were supposedly revolutionary. But really, unless you think that the whole body of economic thought is worthless and can be discarded, any valid macroeconomic theory should flow from the body of economic knowledge, unless the whole foundation is sort of rotten to its core, which it's not. I don't believe there's any evidence of that. So the fact that Keynes's theories were wholly apart from the body of economic knowledge that preceded him is really a damning indictment of his ideas, which have been disproven over the course of history. But yeah, the history of economic thought dates back to the Greeks. They weren't particularly advanced when it comes to economics, but there were some ideas, some precursors to ideas. It's continued on mostly through the Catholic Church, and of course, it reaches its heyday with Cantillon and Smith and onwards. Marx and Marshall, Ricardo, so on and so forth. And there is a lot of substantive knowledge in there.
Left wing or right wing, and effectively the right wing ideology is what's dominated the current version of economics. So what's called neoclassical economics sees capitalism as a system which maximizes people's utility given constraints. That's its orientation. Now, that's treating it like something which was designed to achieve a purpose, and it's not. It's something which evolved out of human culture, our capacity to reason, our capacity to exploit resources.
The record of capitalism is clear. It is a profound wealth creation system, and it does maximize people's utility.
Is why is economics neither a science, nor evolutionary, nor truly revolutionary? And part of the reasoning I go through in the book is that it doesn't undergo scientific revolutions. Practitioners of neoclassical economics will regard rational expectations of a revolution. That's basically window dressing on the same paradigm. They all accept exactly the same paradigm we saw back with Jevons and Walras and Marshall back in the late 1800s. And if you look at Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions, what he sees the genuine science going through is a period of normal science where accepted ideas are extended. Then you hit an anomaly. The anomaly is resolved by a revolution, which changes how you consider the science to be. So, for example, in physics, the quantum mechanical revolution overturned the previous Maxwellian vision, which saw energy as being continuous. Suddenly we have energy coming in discrete units called quanta. Then you have a new paradigm which comes along. It becomes the normal science, then it strikes an anomaly, and you continue repeating this pattern over time. And if you look at the neoclassical paradigm, the same idea of utility maximizing behavior, profit maximizing behavior, optimization, rising marginal cost, falling marginal benefit, et cetera, it's all been there since the 1870s. And
I completely disagree with this. Kuhn's work, very important, basically argues that scientists are sort of like everybody else in that they never really examine their core principles, their axioms. Instead, they get locked into paradigms and they just sort of work within the confines of that paradigm. So, a classic example of this is the person who discovered oxygen, a man by the name of Joseph Priestley. He discovered oxygen, but he really didn't understand what it was that he discovered because he was still locked into the phlogiston paradigm. So he called oxygen dephlogistonated air. So the way that science works, it's not that scientists are just sort of patiently building brick by brick on the edifice of knowledge in a subject. Instead, they're trapped inside these paradigms. And as Keen says here, what happens is errors start popping up, these anomalies, and more errors pop up, and then they reach a crisis point. And when the crisis point hits, they realize they have to abandon this previous paradigm and find a new one. So the most obvious example of a paradigm shift in economics would be the introduction of macroeconomics with Keynes's general theory. This was entirely a paradigm shift, although this shift wasn't because of a crisis point with anomalies. It was really more that Keynesian economics was adopted as a matter of style, as opposed to that it refuted the Misesian framework, which had been dominant prior to the publication of general theory. But the Keynesian paradigm has been experiencing anomalies ever since the publication of general theory. Originally, the idea was that they were going to be able to control inflation and unemployment and balance the two. And of course, they haven't been able to. During the 1970s, you had stagflation, you had high inflation and unemployment, which is something that the Keynesian model really can't account for. And we were supposed to be able to get to full employment. That never really happened. The business cycle is still ongoing. He then goes on to touch upon his theory about the importance of debt.
I'll go through each of the major segments. So I spent about 65 pages talking about why money matters. And if I draw it down to its essence as to why money matters, it's because one of the few things that everybody accepts in macroeconomics is that aggregate expenditure is aggregate income. They are identical. So that's the accepted principle. And using that principle, neoclassicals normally rule out any role for money or credit. But what I show by using a particular application of endogenous money theory to show that credit is part of aggregate demand. Now, I won't go through this table in detail. This is what I call a Moore table after, in honor of Basil Moore. But if you show expenditure on the horizontal and income on the vertical, then you can show that the negative section, the diagonal there is aggregate expenditure by each group. And if credit is coming from the financial sector or the banking sector creating money, which is then spent by the recipient, then credit becomes part of aggregate income. This is the only piece of maths I'm going to show in the presentation. But when you put it together in a loanable funds world, credit cancels out. In the real world of endogenous money, what I call bank originated money and debt, credit is part of aggregate expenditure and aggregate income. And therefore you cannot leave the monetary system out, whereas of course neoclassicals try to exclude it and just talk about real economics, leaving out the monetary system. So credit, because it's so volatile, it has the dominant role in aggregate demand and aggregate income. Now, what that means, and I illustrate this with my Minsky software, which I've designed to fundamentally enable system dynamics type tools to show how monetary economy works. And this is a model I use in the book at one point. Actually, it might be in a companion book, which I'll talk about in a moment. And what I have here is, if you know Paul Krugman talks about patient people lending to impatient people and banks just being an intermediary. And what I show is that that's the case. Then with the parameters I've set this model up with, there's an increase in the amount of lending, there's a decrease in the amount of GDP. Now, then very quickly, and it takes me about 30 seconds to make this change, but just what I want to first emphasize, debt and GDP move in opposite directions in this model, and there is no change in the amount of money. The money is the black line there. With a few simple changes, I go across to the real world, where the bank does the lending to the so-called impatient person. There's no role for the patient person or for reserves in the whole lending process. And what you find is, simply with that structural change, lending and GDP move in the same direction, and changing the amount of debt changes the amount of money.
Okay, there's a lot to unwrap here. But beyond all the models and complicated explanations, Keynes' theory is actually quite simple. He's an inflationist. He believes that when banks create money and then lend it out to consumers, this is good for the economy because it boosts aggregate demand. And here, Keynes has fallen for one of the classic traps. Don't fight a land war in Asia, never go against a Sicilian when death is on the line, and printing money does not create wealth. And it doesn't matter what jargon or techno speak you use to disguise that being your claim. Banks printing money and lending it out to people does not create wealth. Wealth is created through production, through entrepreneurs bringing together natural resources, man-made factors of production, i.e. capital, and labor. If you want wealth, that's how it has to be created. We don't know any other way. Now, Keynes actually kind of close here in that when banks create money and lend it out, this does create the business cycle. Or rather, like he's arguing, this creates the boom and the stopping of this creates the bust. I mean, actually, that's true, but the boom is unhealthy, and like the boom creates the bust itself, because what happens is when banks lend out money that they create, this mimics increased savings in the economy. So it leads to overinvestment or malinvestment, if you will, in capital goods industries. Just like if consumers saved more money and then lent it out in his patient impatient model, then this would signify to entrepreneurs through the price system a greater demand for capital goods industries, in particular through the rate of interest, which, as loanable funds increase and demand to borrow stays the same, the rate of interest decreases. So the central bank buys up government bonds, putting a whole bunch of new money into the banking system, which then gets lent out. This is going to lead to malinvestment in capital goods industries and their eventual liquidation, which will show up in the GDP statistics as a recession. So the key to understanding what Keene is wrong about here is that aggregate demand doesn't matter. It's not a thing. And this is what Say's law teaches us, that supply of X constitutes demand for Y. And this is another thing that Keynes was wrong about. This is another problem with the Keynesian model. Recessions aren't caused by a failure of aggregate demand. It's not that people can't afford or don't want to buy stuff. What happens is that factors of production are realigned. So some businesses have to close up, some investments have to be liquidated and moved around so that production is in line with consumer demand, so that businesses are creating stuff that people want to buy. And the other thing is, it's important to understand that this whole process is not like overly time consuming. Generally, in like about a year, recessions fix themselves. And the reason why we tend to think about longer recessions and depressions is because usually the government steps in and makes matters worse by intervening, by trying to help. They play the Ralph Wiggum role, I'm helping, but in reality, they're making things worse. We saw this during the Great Depression, in particular by trying to keep wage rates up, because part of the whole liquidation process in a recession is falling prices and falling wages. And this is temporary, but it enables businesses to, or entrepreneurs to reorder factors of production, making it easier to hire new workers, to acquire the capital or resources that had to be sold, the land, the businesses. And it's also true of consumer goods. If you try to keep consumer goods high, the price high, then they're not going to sell. So it'll look like people aren't willing to buy, but the reality is they will buy. It's just the price is too high. I mean, the market is always clearing or tending towards equilibrium. So if you have a product that won't sell, then the price is too high. You gotta price it towards the equilibrium price, and then it'll sell. But during the Great Depression, especially Hoover and then FDR tried to maintain price supports. They tried to maintain high prices and high wages. They thought the problem was that people weren't spending enough money, and that if they had higher wages, then they would have more money to spend and everything would get better. But actually, what needed to happen was prices needed to fall, wages needed to fall. It would have been temporary. It wouldn't be a permanent setback. A year later, the economy's booming, wages are right back up to where they were before. It's uh, just very temporary.
And credit plays an essential role because it is so volatile. And I always go back to Bernanke dismissing the role of